was a child in the Girl Scouts, I was taught, always leave a place better than you found it. As an artist, I hope to connect personal time to cosmic time as a means to activate long-term thinking. Back in 2004, I took a trip to Japan. I had just finished an artist residency in New York City, where I live, and I just bought a new camera, and I had been making a lot of photographs about the relationship between humanity and nature. I knew I wanted to find a new project to sink my teeth into, but I wasn't sure yet what it would be. So it was a period of creative churn, where I was sort of following different ideas, but not sure where they would lead. Sometimes traveling to a different country is a great way to stir up your thinking. So when I got to Japan, I did feel a little bit uncomfortable, but then I decided to put that aside and ended up taking this incredible journey to visit a tree called Jomonsugi that's many thousands of years old. When I got there, I made this photograph, and I hadn't yet gotten the idea for the oldest living things in the world, but it really made an impression on me. Around a year later, I was back in New York City and talking to some friends over dinner and telling them what a wonderful and incredible eye-opening travel experience that I'd had. And suddenly, the idea came to me. I would combine art, science, and philosophical thinking about deep time and create the project, The Oldest Living Things in the World. The idea was to find continuously living organisms that are 2,000 years old and older. Why 2,000? Because I wanted to draw attention to how shallow human time frames can be, and instead expand them into much deeper time. So, for instance, why is it 2017 right now? Shouldn't it be 4,500,000,000 2017? So the idea was to look at year zero and back. I ran home that very night and got started on the project. I didn't know then that the project would take me 10 years and take me to every single continent. But what I did know was that I was fascinated in this subject. So I started doing research, and I realized before I could start the project, I would have to figure out what it was I was looking for. So I did many searches on the internet and started to track down scientists and found that there was no area in the sciences that deals with longevity across all species. So I ended up working with 30 different scientists instead of just one that would be my partner. Many adventures ensued. This is me geared up in a safety suit to go into the clean lab at the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen. I'll save you the suspense and tell you that the oldest living thing that we know of is some Siberian actinobacteria living in the permafrost between 400,000 and 600,000 years. So I had gone into the lab and put some soil on a slide and made this image under the microscope. I had to learn to scuba dive for this project, which meant facing my fear of deep water. This is me photographing a 100,000-year-old seagrass meadow. You might wonder, how can this be 100,000 years old? Well, it's growing clonally, so that means that not any single blade of grass is 100,000 years old, but rather the entire organism has been growing and is genetically the same for the past 100,000 years. So it was important to me that everything in the project be an individual, so that way we can relate on an individual basis of what it might feel like to live in a time scale far different from our own. But you don't start out as an expert. I had mentioned I was scared of deep water, so my first dive, I looked more like this. And I was there photographing a 2,000-year-old brain coral. So corals are animals, by the way, so it's not just plants in this project. We already saw bacteria, there's fungi, so there's a lot of kingdoms even involved. What I came to realize is that deep time is sort of like deep water. We're constantly pulled back to the surface to attend to our wants and needs of the moment. But the more you stay in the depths, the more you can look around a little and start to get curious. I went to Greenland. Here I'm wearing an Arctic safety suit to protect against the cold of the fjords. I had a couple misadventures during this project as well. I got lost alone in Greenland for a number of hours, which was pretty terrifying. Obviously, I'm okay. I was there photographing some 3,000-year-old lichens. And sometimes you go to these remote, really difficult places just to find some lichens, these little diminutive things that you would just walk past and not even know they're so ancient unless you knew the science behind it. But these are some of my favorite of the whole project because they grow 1 centimeter every 100 years. And to me, that's a wonderful way to relate to a human lifespan. I mean, what if we spent our entire life just growing 1 centimeter on a rock in Greenland? Continents are drifting away faster than these lichens are growing. And they live here. So sometimes I felt, both in the book and when I have an exhibition, that it's important to show the landscape that these organisms live in. If you just saw those lichens, you might not understand the primordial place that they come from. To me, this is like looking back in time, a window onto the world at a time when it wasn't overrun with humans. On the other side of the world, in Namibia, it's hard to believe anything could be living in this landscape. But in fact, a lot of the oldest living things live in very extreme environments where other things wouldn't even survive, let alone thrive as they do. But here you have plants like the welwitschia, a primitive conifer living out in the vastness of the Namib-Naukluft Desert. When I arrived there, the researchers I was supposed to meet were nowhere to be found. They had left and gone to Angola. And so this sometimes the logistics of travel became the biggest barricade for a particular photo session. So I had to find somebody to take me to the welwitschia, which luckily I was able to do. That's a baby, by the way. In that general area down in South Africa, this is a baobab tree, which I photographed in the Kruger Game Preserve. In this case, we had to have some armed rangers escort us to visit the tree because sometimes lions passed by, but we didn't see any that day. Another ancient favorite of mine is this chestnut tree living in Sicily. It's 3,000 years old. I came to realize as I was doing this project that I wasn't making landscape images of nature, but rather trying to make portraits of these ancient beings. You can see all these wonderful faces and configurations in the bark here, and see the patina of age with the moss, and sometimes even some positive human intervention with the crutches there supporting the split trunk. And of course, we have the Yareta plants. So these are sort of like the poster children of the project. You might remember this one from your ticket. The Yareta are very strange plants living in the Atacama Desert in Chile. This one is perhaps upward of 3,000 years old. They live at very high elevations, and they're very dense. They're not soft at all. And they're not moss over rocks. They're actually shrubs. And they're made up of thousands of branches with clusters of little leaves around them. This is a Yaretal, or a Yareta field. And one of my favorite facts about these is that they're related to carrots and parsley and other things that you might eat every day, even though they look like they could be an alien life form. For me, though, sometimes it was the quiet moments in the landscape that were the most meaningful to me. There are a number of Yaretas actually out in this landscape. But to me, it could have been the surface of Mars. Another favorite is this one. These are olives fallen at the base of a 3,000-year-old olive tree. in some ways, this sort of turns on its head the idea that youth is the only source of lush life. So we still have these this olive tree persevering after all of these years. This is the tree itself, living in, and the pride of, a small town in Crete. Now, this one is particularly surprising. You might not guess that this is part of a 43,600-year-old shrub living in Tasmania. There's only one of its kind left on the planet. So these are actually clippings cut from the plant in the wild, and they're in the Botanic Garden in Hobart, where scientists are studying it. So it's both critically endangered. There's one of its species left on Earth. But it's also theoretically immortal, because plants that are growing clonally can self-propagate. So they can keep producing new shoots and branches, the same genetic material as it has always been, but it can only do so as long as favorable conditions persist. This is another clonal colony. You might not guess that this is 80,000 years old. This is called Pando, living in Utah. What looks like a forest is, in a sense, a single tree. Now, obviously, when we're talking about nature, we're also going to have to think about the environment and climate change. This is essentially a portrait of climate change. And what I mean by that is, if you see these scrubby little branches at the bottom, for the first 9,500 years of this tree's life, it just was that scrubby little pile there. But over the past 50 or 60 years, the trunk started to grow upward. And why is that? The climate zone actually changed at the top of this mountaintop plateau in Sweden. It got warmer. So this is in such a remote place, you wouldn't see too many humans interacting with this at all. But it just goes to show that the entire planet is interconnected and is affected by what's happening with the warming climate. The same is true with the bristlecone pines. So these are the oldest unitary organisms in the world. So I've told you about clonal plants. These are singular, as in humans are unitary organisms, as are these trees, the bristlecone pines. But they're not immune to the effects of climate change either. They live very high in the mountains in California, but what's happening as the temperature gets warmer, things like invasive beetles and fungi have started to infest the trees. These things used to be kept at bay from the cold temperatures, but now are starting to affect the oldest living trees in the world. And one of the saddest and most impactful moments for me was when the senator tree died. This was a 3,500-year-old tree living outside of Orlando, Florida. I had visited it first in 2006 and made some photographs. And, I had just come back from Africa. It had been this amazing adventure. And I went to Florida. I live in the United States, and it was just easy. I didn't really think anything about it. It was sort of not very much of a challenge. And I'd made some photographs, and I thought, I'm not too crazy about these, but I can go back anytime. It's so easy to get there. But less than 5 years later, this happened. One night, some kids had snuck into the park, and you can see there's actually even a fence. Oops, excuse me. There's a little fence that had been around this tree. It was in a protected park. Some kids had snuck in to do some drugs inside the hollow of the tree. They ended up lighting matches and burning it to the ground. The tree was on fire for a week before anybody knew, because it was burning from the inside out. For me, this was a profound moment, because I realized I was taking for granted that just because this tree had this immense longevity did not mean that it was immortal. it is not permanent. So it was a very striking and important moment to me in this project. This image was made in Tasmania. This is another view where you see the hand of humanity. This image is of a dead part of a living colony of Huon pine that are 10,500 years old. These live on a mining site. So in some cases, it's very interesting where you have, because mining is being done, an environmental impact study is required. And then in some cases, these very ancient lives are found. So in some ways, that leads to discovery, but obviously it creates a deep impact on the ecosystem itself. Although these trees were very likely killed from a lightning strike. This is one of my favorites in terms of just the experience that I had and the story behind it. So here we are in Antarctica at Elephant Island. A lot of these expeditions were very difficult to plan, but Elephant Island was probably the most difficult. It took me about 2 years to complete the research and to find a ship that would take me to Antarctica. It's a little difficult to see, but if you see the little bit of green on that slope, that's 5,500-year-old moss. And if that isn't incredible enough, I had no idea there were these ancient organisms living in Antarctica. This island happens to be the place where the Shackleton expedition was marooned. So Ernest Shackleton was an explorer in the times of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, about 100 years ago. But when he and his crew arrived, the ship promptly sank. So they were marooned in Antarctica for 2 years. And a better part of a year of that was on this island, right around the corner from this 5,500-year-old moss. Now, for me, it was a big challenge to get to Antarctica. And once I was there, I was on a modern ship full of all the comforts you could need. I did do something called the polar plunge, which is what it sounds. It's going swimming in Antarctica. It's hard for me to recommend it, but it definitely was an interesting experience. So I jumped out of the water and got all bundled up. And I thought about Shackleton and his crew in Antarctica, shivering in sweaters for 2 years. And I realized how lucky I was to have the comforts that I do. But it made me think about perseverance of the human spirit, and perseverance of these incredible organisms, and what rich symbolism those hold. Finally, this is Shackleton's gravesite. So, as I said, the story really moved me, the courage that an explorer must have at a time when so much of our world was unmapped. Shackleton and his crew survived, but when he returned to another visit, he ended up dying of a heart attack the next day. This is his grave with a nice elephant seal guarding it. So I've talked to you a bit about these different organisms and about time. I want to talk a moment about temporal layering. So you have these things that have been alive for 2 or 10 or hundreds of thousands of years on one hand. And on the other hand, you have this 60th of a second click of the shutter. And somewhere in between the two are you and me. And yet we all come together to share a moment. There's something profound in looking at time and understanding that we're part of a bigger fabric. My idea is that when we connect with timescales outside of our own, we start to think about the choices that we make on a day-to-day basis in a different way. Not just how something might affect us right now, or I haven't checked my phone in 3 minutes, and what am I going to do? But instead, thinking about not just the days and weeks to come, but the generations to come. You remember these lichens that I showed you towards the beginning. Well, after I photographed them, I learned that some of them had been taken out into space by astrobiologists looking for the origins of life on Earth. They were exposed to outer space conditions and returned completely healthy and intact. This really fascinated me. I also learned that the stromatolites, which I photographed in Western Australia, first originated on Earth 3.5 billion years ago. The stromatolites are part biologic and part geologic. They're made of bound cyanobacteria and non-living sediments like sand and silt. So this colony is between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. But the very first bacterium perhaps could have piggybacked in on a meteorite and landed maybe on this very beach. It was time to start venturing out into space. This image was made after I completed The Oldest Living Things. It was made at one of the NASA sites in the US. And you're not actually looking up into space here, but rather down to the ground. This was made on the floor of the NASA Ames machine shop, a place where a number of satellites and other spacecraft from the US space program were made. I realized that I wanted to take the ideas of connecting with deep time and expand them beyond the geologic time of Earth and out into the cosmic time of space. So one of the projects that I've done in the past 2 years is create a timeline called Selected History of the Space-Time Continuum. It starts before the Big Bang and goes 10 to the 101 billion years into the future. You can see it's all comprised of handwriting. So the idea was, just like with Oldest Living Things, to create a personal way to create milestones in the vastness of time that we wouldn't otherwise be able to process. So it has things like the first stars, which appeared 400 million years after the Big Bang, through to the last stars, a duodecillion years from now. But perhaps one of my favorite is something that happened around 41,000 years ago. We've recently discovered the oldest known surviving painting. It's called Red Dot, made by a Neanderthal artist. So it turns out that art was important to the human experience even before we were fully human. It was found in this El Castillo cave in Spain. Another thing that I've been working on is this idea of making ephemeral artworks about eternity. This is a sand mandala called Cosmic Microwave Mandala, combining the traditional art of Buddhist sand mandalas with the cutting-edge science of cosmology, the study of the origin and fate of the universe. I spent 2 weeks creating the sand mandala. It's just sand. And this was made at a museum in California. And if it seems like hunching over day in and day out and doing this delicate work is difficult, it is. But I found that when I looked at my personal discomfort in the lens of the wider idea of the universe, I found my perspective and my consciousness expanding. What is the cosmic microwave background, you might ask? It's known as the baby picture of the universe. It's light imprinted on the sky 380,000 years after the Big Bang. So it's sort of like a map of the nascent universe where scientists can go back and decode the origin story of the universe. So it took 2 weeks to create and a matter of moments to destroy. And I passed out the sand to anyone who'd come to the gallery to receive some. The last project I want to share with you is something that I came to just as I was finishing, just as the Oldest Living Things book was coming out in English. You might be familiar with the Japanese art of kintsukuroi, or golden repair, that's traditionally done on pottery. Well, I got the idea to create something called sidewalk kintsukuroi. I was so struck by the idea of something being more beautiful for having been broken that I wanted to take it from off the shelf as a precious object and literally put it out in the streets. I had already been making photographs like this and was thinking about geologic time. So it's not like we could witness the formation of mountains and canyons, but in an urban setting, we can see cracks form over time. And I realized that I wanted to start repairing them. So some of these are works on paper, so I made a photograph and then painted the gold on top of them. These are all in the US. This is in New York. The past one was at a museum in Massachusetts. And some are directly in the ground. And so I use a combination of resin and both bronze powders and actual gold. So there was something to me that also resonated with the oldest living things, this idea of healing, this idea of taking something that's literally beneath our notice and understanding that we can make it into something precious and truly to be cared for. So if you're wondering, though, how the oldest living things is going, I'm very happy to say that while I'm here in China, I will be visiting 2 of the world's oldest ginkgo trees this coming week. So with that, I leave you with the Chinese edition of my book. 谢谢。